It's stout season. I am drinking 5 readily available store-bought stouts, and I'm going to pick a favorite. Welcome back to the House Brewing Company YouTube channel, where from time to time we do samplings, tastings, we pick favorites, and we talk about our brand that we've built here in central Massachusetts. For today's tasting, Michael has prepared for me, presumably, 5 quote-unquote regularly available store-bought barrel-aged stouts. I do not know which stouts are in front of me. I can certainly guess what they might be based on what I might think would be a readily available store-bought stout. But for the purposes of this tasting, I do not know what I'm drinking. If you guys like the video, it's a very simple gesture, as well as commenting on the video and subscribing to the channel. If you enjoy this content, it's a huge help to us. So thank you for that simple gesture. Let's dive right into sample A. Am I doing A today? A, B, C, D, E? All right, sample A. Pretty muted nose. These are beers that I don't expect to use the word muted on. I expect big, robust chocolate, caramel, bourbon characteristics. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what a barrel-aged stout is, in the brewing industry, basically, you make a high-gravity stout, which has a fair amount of residual sugar content, and then you put that into a barrel that had previously held American bourbon. Typically, those beers will linger in there for 3 months to as long as 2 years or 3 years, and it will impart that bourbon characteristic while also introducing a little bit of oxidative character to the beer. So that's typically the general idea of what a barrel-aged stout is. Woo! All right, we're pretty boozy out of the gate there. Not super viscous, not super luscious on the palate. It's got a fair amount of oxidative character that I'm not a huge fan of. Now, again, I did mention that barrel-aged stout will typically have oxidative characteristics, but this almost trends too far onto that like leathery tobacco, almost wet dog character that I don't particularly love. The bourbon note's a little bit one note, very sharp. I don't get the impression that this was in those barrels for very long. The character seems very woody. It seems very ephemeral. It doesn't seem super complex and rich. That's sample number 1. Now, appearance-wise, sample number 2 looks bigger. It looks more rich, maybe sweeter, maybe more saccharine, maybe more bourbon character, because the ring there around the head is very, very, very dark, which is different from every other sample that you see here. You can see kind of the rest of the samples have a tan-colored head, whereas this guy on a swirl brings you this almost dark chocolate, super intense looking beer. Whoa! Woo! Wow. That is like night and day compared to sample number 1. That is wicked fudgy. Wow. Like Tootsie Roll, bourbon candy. Holy cow. These two here are incomparable. I don't know what I expected necessarily, but this is awesome. Wow. Bourbon, fudge, booze, sweetness, big mouthfeel, medium carbonation. That is a treat. I want to pour it over vanilla ice cream and just have a party. Wonderful expression there, sample number 2. I feel like that's going to ruin the rest of the panel. Just based on appearances alone, very robust, very rich. Moving on to sample number 3. All right, this one has kind of a sharp bourbon character. Not a lot of wood, just kind of like straightforward bourbon candy, a little bit of milk chocolate. Smells a little bit sweet to me. Yeah, that's super solid. Classic barrel-aged stout, a little bit of Tootsie Roll characteristic. Not a lot of oxidation like the first sample. Medium body, pretty expressive, full mouthfeel, complexity, really nicely balanced, nicely round. Kind of nice. Sample number 4. Chocolatey. Not as bourbon forward. This beer kind of hit me in the nose with heat, whereas sample number 4, a little more rounded, a little more chocolate. Almost like lactose. Huh. Man, I will tell you that we've never done anything remotely similar to this style of sampling. Typically, I do lighter beer, even hoppy beer, you know, 4% ABV up to 8% ABV. I'm on sample number 4 right now, and I'm going to have a hard time going back through these. Sample number 4, a lot more chocolatey, not as much bourbon in your face, not as much heat, a little bit more well balanced, a little bit sweet, almost tastes lactose like, really creamy and smooth. Another solid example of readily available bourbon barrel stout. Sample number 5. Nice, well rounded. Again, milk chocolate. Not a ton of bourbon character on the nose. I don't know what it is about these readily available stouts where just not as potent. Whew, we got to go back to work after this. All right, sample number 5 had more of that oxidative character that I associated with the first sample that I tasted. And my impression of that sample was that it was kind of one of the lesser of the 5. I am going to go back through, smell and taste one more time. But my general first impressions of the set are a little bit lacking complexity in sample number 1, a little bit thin, a little bit of oxidation, not my favorite. Sample number 2 blows the doors off all the rest of these. I don't want to call a favorite just yet, but very incredibly rich, robust, clearly spent more time in the barrel, a lot more complexity, a lot more nuance, not a lot of oxidation. Very nice beer. Sample number 2, very rich, very rich. If you're drinking this, I would definitely recommend splitting it with one or more, or 2 or more people potentially. It's a very heavy beer. Samples number 3 and 4, I thought were in competition for the top 3 slots to be sure. And then sample number 5, I thought exhibited some of that oxidative character as the first sample, and it may fall near the bottom of my rankings. I thought they were going to be easier. Like, I would have to guess that in the panel, the only 2 beers that come to mind that I would think are definitely in here, I would think are KBS from Founders and Bourbon County Stout from Goose Island. I would think that those would be the ones that Michael would pick, but I don't know that for a fact. Wow. So fudgy. So like grandma's fudge right there. One thing is totally for sure. As these are allowed to warm up, they become a lot more expressive. The more I spend time with them, the more that I swirl them in the glass, the more complexity expresses itself. So anytime you are enjoying a barrel aged stout at home, certainly start at 40 or 45 degrees, but let it simmer. Enjoy that glass. Don't be afraid to swirl it around. Don't be afraid to let it warm up. You will be rewarded with a more expressive beer. All right, this I have to be honest. This is hard. This is different from blending beer. Trying to taste and identify and pick a favorite of these 5. So my favorite is sample number 2, a big, bold, expressive beer that you will stay warm if you drink it. You will be happy if you drink it. Definitely share it with somebody. Whoa, big, beautiful beer. My second favorite, I'm struggling to pick a favorite between samples number 3 and 4. They both had really nice characteristic. I thought sample 4 had a little more chocolate. I thought sample 3 was a little more well-rounded, a little more bourbon forward. If I was forced to choose, I think my number 2 would be sample number 3, and my number 3 would be sample number 4. And then my number 4 would be sample number 5. And then my least favorite of the sampling would be the very first sample that we tried today, sample number 1.
Okay, so your least favorite is Boulevard's Whiskey Barrel Stout,
Okay.
then Dragon's Milk.
This is Dragon's Milk.
Yep.
Oh, wow.
All right, and then that is KBS,
This is KBS,
Goose Island,
Goose Island,
Treehouse Truth.
Truth.
Dan had a couple bottles stashed away, so I didn't know.
Did he put you up to that?
Yes.
Dan did? All right. I got all thrown off. I did not expect our beer to be in the sampling. Kind of an unfair example. I'm not sure if it was a fair comparison, but I will say that the Bourbon County Stout, I'm not surprised that I picked it as my second favorite. This is the beer that led Rise to all the beers in this panel, for sure. It's an originator. It's always been great. Do you know, is this year's vintage?
2023.
So last year's vintage, probably been hanging out on the shelf for a little while. Yeah, Goose Island, always a classic. KBS, always a classic. I thought that these two represented themselves really well. I thought that the Dragon's Milk and the Boulevard were a little bit weaker in the sampling. The Truth was in a different class altogether, and I don't think it was a necessarily fair comparison because the amount of heft to it, it would have been more interesting to taste this sample in a panel of kind of smaller batch, more exclusive bourbon barrel aged brewers, and I think we should do that again in the future. It was a very clear standout in this panel, much more robust, obviously more complex, but the Bourbon County Stout and the KBS were super awesome in this sampling. Stout season is the best season. I want to thank you guys for watching. Remember to hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you next time. Take care.